New York never sleeps except when it's too scared to. That night, the city's heartbeat slowed, and the man responsible wasn't yelling orders, he was whispering them. It was a Thursday night in Manhattan, early 1930s, and the rain had been falling all day. Not the kind of hard rain that bounces off the sidewalk and makes you run for cover, no, this was the slow, steady kind. The kind that turns the streets into black mirrors, catching every neon reflection from the bar signs in drugstores. The kind that makes the air heavy, like the city's holding its breath. Most nights, you could hear 100 different sounds on Mulberry Street: cab horns, the clatter of delivery trucks, couples laughing too loud outside of speakeasies. But not that night. That night, the sounds were smaller. Softer. The smart people were inside, and the dumb ones had someone watching their back. I was walking alone, coat collar turned up, hat brim low. Not because I was worried, I wasn't. When you're me, you don't walk fast, you don't look over your shoulder. You walk like you own the ground under your shoes. And, in a way, I did. From the corner of Elizabeth Street, I could see a couple of the boys stationed outside Sal's cafe, leaning against the brick, pretending to smoke like they were just killing time. But I knew better. They were there because I told them to be there. Eyes on the street. Ears open. Hands ready. Inside the cafe, it was warm and loud, not with music, but with the kind of talk that dies down when I walk in. I didn't have to raise my voice. I didn't even have to look at anyone for more than a second. The thing about power is, when you really got it, you don't need to remind people every 5 minutes. They just know. I slid into my usual booth in the back, facing the door. That's rule number 1, always face the door. Not because you're paranoid. Because you're prepared. The smell of espresso and frying garlic filled the air, and I could feel the heat from the kitchen drifting out every time someone pushed through the swinging doors. A kid named Vinny came over, maybe 20 years old, nervous energy all over him. He placed an envelope on the table, the kind that doesn't need to be opened to know what's inside. I nodded, told him to sit. He didn't touch his coffee, just stared at his hands like they might tell him what to do next. "Relax, kid," I said, my voice low enough that only he could hear. "If you're scared, you ain't thinking straight. And if you ain't thinking straight, you're already dead. That's the thing, most guys think being in this life means acting tough all the time. Me? I learned a long time ago, calm wins. Calm makes people lean in to hear you. Calm makes people afraid to disappoint you." Outside, the rain picked up just a little, and through the window I caught the reflection of a black Packard rolling slow down the block. My eyes didn't move, but I clocked it, no plates. I recognized 2 silhouettes inside. Could be nothing. Could be something. Either way, I knew the boys outside would handle it before it ever became my problem. We talked business for another 20 minutes, quiet, deliberate. The envelope stayed on the table until I was done. When I finally stood, I didn't tuck it under my coat like I was hiding it. I just picked it up and walked out. Like I said, you walk like you own the ground. The street smelled like wet stone and cigarette smoke. The Packard was gone, but the rain kept falling, soft and steady. The boys gave me the smallest nod as I passed. No words. We didn't need words. Back at my apartment, I poured myself 2 fingers of whiskey and sat by the window, looking out over the city. From up here, the rain turned the lights into smudges of color. You couldn't hear the noise of the streets, just the distant hum of a city that was mine, piece by piece. Some men get power and they shout it from the rooftops. Me? I liked it quiet. Quiet meant control. Quiet meant no one saw you coming until it was too late. That night, New York slept lighter than usual, but it slept. And I sat there in the dark, listening to the rain, knowing that the silence outside wasn't the city resting. It was the city waiting. Waiting for me to make my next move. You can take the boy out of Sicily, but you can't take Sicily out of the boy, especially when the new world greets you with closed fists. Before the rain-slick streets of Manhattan were mine, there were cobblestone alleys in a small Sicilian town that taught me what survival really meant. I came into this world in 1897, in a place where the sun baked the stone walls till they cracked, and every face in the piazza knew your name and your family's business. We didn't have much. A few chickens, a little bread, and the kind of pride that keeps a man standing even when his pockets are empty. My father, Antonio, worked like a mule, but no matter how many hours he broke his back, there was never enough. And my mother, God bless her, she had this way of making a pot of beans taste like a feast. That was Sicily, short on money, long on dignity. But it was also a place where a boy learned early who to respect and who to stay out of the way of. Men with dark suits and darker reputations walked the streets like they owned the sunlight, and people stepped aside without a word. Even as a kid, I noticed the way the air changed when they passed. My old man told me to keep my head down, but I was already taking mental notes. When I was 9, my family packed up everything we could carry and boarded a ship to America. My mother said it was for opportunity. My father said it was for work. I knew it was for survival. The trip was long, the kind of long where days blur into each other and the only thing that changes is the weather. The smell of the ship, salt water, coal smoke, and too many bodies in too small a space still sticks in my head. When we finally saw the Statue of Liberty through the morning fog, my mother cried. My father just nodded, like he was shaking hands with destiny. Me? I looked at that skyline and thought, that's a lot of windows. That's a lot of people. A lot of chances. We ended up in the Lower East Side, crammed into a tenement where the walls were so thin you could hear your neighbor snore. The hallways smelled like boiled cabbage and coal dust, and the streets outside were louder than anything I'd ever heard, vendors yelling in 5 different languages, kids running barefoot, men arguing over cards on the corner. It was chaos, but it was alive. The thing about the Lower East Side back then, it didn't matter where you came from, you were part of a tribe. Italians stuck with Italians, Jews with Jews, Irish with Irish. And those lines? They didn't just keep the peace. Sometimes they drew the battlefields. I went to school, sure, but the real education was outside. That's where I met Meyer Lansky. He was a skinny kid, sharp eyes, even sharper tongue. We couldn't have been more different, me with my Sicilian temper, and him with his quiet calculation, but we recognized something in each other. We were both thinking bigger than the block we were standing on. Then there was Benny Siegel Bugsy. He wasn't subtle like Meyer. Benny was all flash and fast hands, quick to smile, quicker to throw a punch. The 3 of us? We were trouble before we even knew how to spell the word. We started small. Running errands for guys who had bigger problems than carrying packages themselves. Keeping watch outside a card game. Delivering messages that weren't written on paper. The pay wasn't much, but the lessons? Those were priceless. I learned that in America, money didn't just talk, it sang. And the ones who knew the tune got to dance. I learned that respect was worth more than gold, and fear? Fear was the kind of currency that never lost value. The old country taught me to recognize power. The new country taught me how to take it. And it didn't take long to figure out that the men in the best suits weren't always the richest, they were the ones who could make things happen without anyone ever seeing their hand in the game. One night, maybe I was 14, I saw something that stuck with me. Meyer and I were hanging around the corner when a local tough named Fat Sal tried to rough up an old shopkeeper over protection money. Before it got ugly, another man stepped in. He didn't shout. He didn't throw a punch. He just put his hand on Sal's shoulder, whispered something in his ear, and Sal walked away like a dog that had just been called home. That was the moment I knew real power doesn't need to raise its voice. By the time I was 16, I was speaking English just fine, though I never lost the Sicilian in my words. I could move between neighborhoods without trouble, play cards with the Italians, shoot dice with the Jews, and drink with the Irish. Connections were everything, and I was building them without even knowing it. But opportunity has a way of walking hand in hand with danger. The streets didn't hand you a future for free. If you wanted something, you took it, and if you took it, you held it tight. Looking back now, I can see it clear. The Lower East Side wasn't just a home. It was a forge. And every fight, every hustle, every handshake was the hammer that shaped me. By the time the 1920s rolled around, I wasn't just another immigrant kid anymore. I had friends. I had enemies. And I had a plan. America had given me its rules, and I'd already started figuring out how to bend them. Some kids played stickball. We played survival, and the stakes were a lot higher than a broken window. If the Lower East Side was my classroom, the 5 Points was my graduate school. The neighborhood had history, bad history. Years before I was running its streets, it was already famous for gangs, gambling dens, and the kind of taverns where a man could lose his week's pay or his life before midnight. By the time I came into my own, it was still the same, just dressed in newer clothes. The streets there were alive in a different way. Not just busy, charged. You could feel the tension in the air like the static before a storm. Irish crews, Italian outfits, Jewish syndicates, everyone packed in tight, and every block was a border. You didn't cross one without knowing whose eyes were on you. I remember the first time Meyer, Benny, and I went down there together. We were just kids, 17, maybe 18, but we already thought we were bigger than we were. We walked into a pool hall on Bayard Street like we belonged there, which is half the trick. Inside, the smell of chalk dust and cigar smoke hung thick, and a half-dozen men stopped mid-game to give us the kind of look that says, "You better have a reason for being here." Our reason was simple: opportunity. In the 5 Points, a smart kid could pick up work fast, running packages, carrying messages, making introductions that came with a tip and a pat on the shoulder. You just had to prove you could handle yourself. That day, we proved it the hard way. A local tough didn't like the look of Benny's grin and decided to test him. Words were exchanged, then fists. Benny moved quicker than anyone expected, and dropped the guy with 2 shots to the jaw. The room went dead quiet. Meyer pulled me aside and whispered, "Now we see if they respect us or bury us." Turns out, they respected us. The man Benny floored even sent us drinks later, which is about as close to an apology as you get in this life. From then on, we weren't just the kids from the Lower East Side. We were useful. And in neighborhoods like that, usefulness is a currency all its own. The 5 Points taught me about balance. Not the kind you use to keep from falling, the kind you use to keep from getting killed. You had to know when to stand your ground and when to step aside. When to smile, and when to keep your mouth shut. I watched older guys, real operators, make deals in whispers over a single glass of whiskey, then step outside and settle an old score with a handshake instead of a bullet. Not because they'd gone soft, but because they knew a bullet was loud, and noise draws eyes. Eyes draw cops. And cops were bad for business. Still, there were times when violence wasn't just unavoidable, it was necessary. I saw that too. A man named Little Frankie ran a numbers game in the neighborhood and refused to cut in the right people. One night, he disappeared. No body, no noise. Just gone. And suddenly, the numbers game belonged to someone else. That was the way the points worked here one day, gone the next, replaced before the coffee was cold. By the early 20s, prohibition was in full swing, and that turned the whole neighborhood into a gold mine. Speakeasies popped up behind every fake storefront, and liquor flowed like the Hudson. Everyone wanted a piece, and everyone was willing to fight for it. But I didn't want to fight for scraps. I wanted the bakery. Meyer and I started small, running booze from Jersey into the city, using Benny's quick hands and quicker mouth to smooth over any trouble along the way. We built connections with suppliers, doormen, bartenders. We greased palms, made friends, and most importantly, never took more than we could protect. It wasn't just about making money, it was about making the right people see us as reliable. And it worked. Soon enough, we weren't just moving crates, we were running whole supply lines. Our names started showing up in conversations we weren't supposed to hear. Guys with power started asking for us by name. And with every job, every handshake, we were stepping closer to the center of something much bigger. But in the 5 points, success came with a shadow. The more people knew who you were, the more some of them wanted to see you fall. Rivals started sniffing around, looking for cracks. The cops started recognizing our faces. And the old guard, the real bosses, started taking an interest. That's when I met Joe the Boss Masuria. He was the kind of man who filled a room just by sitting in it. Heavy set, slow smile, eyes that could go from warm to ice in a heartbeat. He invited Meyer and me to a backroom meeting one night, not to threaten us, but to measure us. And if there's one thing I learned early, it's that in this life, being measured is just the first step to being used. He asked questions about our work, our connections, our plans. We answered carefully, honest enough to seem trustworthy, vague enough to stay in control. When we left, Meyer said, "We just shook hands with the future, lucky." I wasn't so sure. Sometimes the future's holding a knife behind its back. Still, that meeting opened doors. We were allowed to operate in new territories, take bigger jobs, move in circles where decisions were made. But it also meant stepping deeper into a world where every favor had a price, and every alliance came with a clock ticking toward betrayal. Walking home that night, I looked around at the 5 points, the crowded tenements, the glowing windows, the narrow streets slick with spilled beer and rain. This place had been my playground, my proving ground. But I knew I couldn't stay here forever. The city was bigger than these few blocks, and my ambitions were bigger still. The 5 points taught me the rules of survival. Now it was time to learn how to rewrite them. If you think loyalty's a handshake, you've never seen a man swear it with his own blood. The 5 points gave me my education, but Joe Masuria gave me my entrance exam. When you work around a man like the boss, you start to understand something. He's not just a leader because people fear him. He's a leader because he decides who gets to eat and who goes hungry. I'd been running jobs under his blessing for a while, proving myself, staying reliable. I didn't talk more than I needed to, didn't brag about the money, and didn't make enemies. I didn't have to. Masuria noticed. And when he notices you, sooner or later you're gonna be called in for something bigger. It happened on a cold night, the kind that turns the city's breath into smoke. A messenger came to me with nothing but an address and a time. No explanation. No name. I knew better than to ask questions. The address led to a narrow, unmarked door on a side street. 2 men I'd never seen before stood outside, each holding a cigar like they'd been told to let it burn down slow. One of them nodded, opened the door, and motioned me inside. The room was dim, heavy with the smell of wine and candle wax. Around a long table sat a dozen men, some I recognized, most I didn't. In the center of the table was a small dish of burning paper, the smoke curling like it was looking for a way out. At the far end, Masuria sat with a calm smile, gesturing for me to come forward. "Salvatore," he said, using my given name, "tonight you stop being just a man who works for me. Tonight, you become one of us." I'd heard whispers about this, the induction, the ceremony, the oath. But whispers never do the real thing justice. One of the men took a card, drew a small image of a saint on it, and pricked my finger with a needle. A drop of blood landed on the card. "This is the blood of your life," the man said quietly, his voice low but sharp. "You burn it, and you burn with us. You betray it, and you burn alone." They lit the card from the candle flame, and I held it in my hands until it turned to ash. The smoke stung my eyes, but I didn't blink. I repeated the words they gave me, a vow of silence, loyalty, and obedience. In that moment, I wasn't just a street operator anymore. I was Cosa Nostra. Masuria stood and put a hand on my shoulder. "You understand now," he said. "There's no going back." And I did understand. I understood that this wasn't just about brotherhood. It was about belonging to something older than the city itself, a set of rules that came from across the ocean, passed down through whispers and blood. After that night, the jobs changed. Bigger stakes, higher pay, and a lot less room for mistakes. If before I'd been trusted to carry the packages, now I was trusted to decide where the packages went. I was introduced to men who ran numbers in 3 boroughs, who owned bars that didn't look like bars, who could get you a truckload of Canadian whiskey without it ever touching a customs dock. But with the trust came something else, expectation. Every favor Masuria gave me was a debt I'd have to repay. Every door he opened for me was a door he could just as easily close. I'd seen what happened to men who didn't deliver. Sometimes it was a bullet in the back alley. Sometimes it was worse, being cut off completely, frozen out until you were just another nameless body in the street. One afternoon, Meyer pulled me aside. "You know this can't last forever," he said. "Masuria's old school. The world's changing faster than he wants it to." I knew what he meant. Prohibition had turned the underworld into big business. The bootleg operations, the gambling rackets, the unions, they weren't just about muscle anymore. They were about organization. And organization meant profit. But the old guard? They still thought in terms of neighborhoods, grudges, and honor codes that got in the way of smart business. Still, for the moment, I played my role. I smiled at the right times, agreed when I needed to, and kept my own ambitions tucked away like a pistol in an ankle holster. There was no point in rushing things. In this life, patience wasn't just a virtue, it was survival. One job stands out from those early days. A shipment of Canadian whiskey was coming in through the docks, worth more than a man would see in 5 lifetimes. My task: make sure it got from the water to a warehouse in Brooklyn without any interference from cops, rivals, or anyone in between. We moved at night, quiet as shadows. Benny drove, Meyer rode shotgun, and I sat in the back with a hand on the revolver under my coat. Twice we saw headlights trailing us too long, but they peeled off after catching sight of the escort cars we had running interference. When we finally rolled into that Brooklyn warehouse, I exhaled for the first time in hours. The next morning, Masuria sent me a single word through a messenger: "Bravo." In his world, that was high praise. But something about the way he said it, even through a messenger, told me he was measuring me again. Testing how far I could go before I stopped being useful and started being dangerous. That's the other thing about blood oaths: they're not just about loyalty to them. They're about making sure you never forget who you belong to. As the weeks turned into months, I could feel the tension between the old ways and the new ideas building like pressure in a steam pipe. The men who thought like me, Lansky, Costello, others, were already talking about streamlining operations, cutting down on the senseless turf wars. The old bosses saw that as weakness. I knew a storm was coming. I didn't know when or exactly how, but I knew. And when it broke, I'd have to choose which side I was on. For now, I kept my head down, my hands busy, and my ears open. Because in the Mafia, you don't rise by talking. You rise by listening and waiting for the right moment to speak. Sometimes the sharpest weapon in this life ain't a gun, it's a smile. After the night of the blood oath, I started noticing something about the way people looked at me. Before, I was just another sharp-dressed kid with a knack for getting things done. Now, there was a kind of respect, or maybe fear, in their eyes. The kind that comes when people know you're not just working for the family, you are the family. But being part of Cosa Nostra didn't mean walking around like a thug looking for trouble. That was for the street punks. The real power players? They knew presentation was half the game. I took a page from the men who'd been doing it longer than me, guys like Costello, who could walk into a room full of bankers and make them feel like they were lucky to shake his hand. It was about more than silk suits and polished shoes, though I made sure I had those too. It was about blending the underworld with the upper one so no one could tell exactly where one ended and the other began. The press started calling me lucky, though the truth was, luck had very little to do with it. I played the part, smiling in photographs, tipping my hat to dames on the sidewalk, shaking hands with ward politicians at public events. If you saw me at the Stork Club or Lindy's, you'd think I was just another businessman enjoying the nightlife. And in a way, I was. But every handshake was an introduction, every drink was a meeting, and every polite laugh was a calculated move. The whole city was a chessboard, and I made sure I was learning every square. Masuria liked that I could move between worlds. He was a creature of the old neighborhood, suspicious of anything that didn't come with an accent and a family history from Sicily. But even he could see that times were changing. Prohibition had turned gangsters into millionaires overnight, and millionaires needed to look the part. One evening, we were at an uptown restaurant, white tablecloths, chandeliers, waiters who spoke in soft tones like they were delivering secrets instead of soup. A politician came over to shake my hand, ignoring Masuria entirely. The old man didn't say anything, but I could feel his eyes on me the rest of the night. That's the thing about power, some men don't like sharing the spotlight. It didn't stop me. In fact, I leaned into it. I started investing in nightclubs, not just for the money, but because they were the perfect meeting grounds. Everyone came through those doors: actors, businessmen, union bosses, cops. In one night, you could make connections it would take months to arrange anywhere else. Meyer and I ran numbers in the back rooms while the front stayed clean. We made sure the bands got paid, the liquor kept flowing, and the police stayed in a generous mood. I learned to treat every cop on the beat like he was doing me a favor just by walking past my place without asking questions. Because in truth, he was. It wasn't all champagne and piano music, though. Every now and then, trouble would come knocking. One night, a couple of young punks tried to make a name for themselves by shaking down one of my bartenders. They picked the wrong night. I was there. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I just stepped in close, looked the kid in the eye, and told him, "You want to work in this town, you work with me. Otherwise, you don't work at all." I let that hang in the air until he understood I wasn't talking about bartending anymore. The next day, those kids were gone. Nobody saw them in Manhattan again. And word got around, lucky Luciano wasn't a man you crossed. Still, I kept my image polished. I knew the future of the business wasn't in scaring people, it was in making them want to do business with you. The gangsters who relied only on fear burned bright and quick. I was building something that would last. That's when I started hearing more about Salvatore Maranzano. He was cut from the same Sicilian cloth as Masuria, but sharper, more calculating. He dressed like a banker, spoke like a priest, and thought like a general. Men whispered that he was different, that he could be the one to unite the families under a real structure. I kept my distance at first. No sense in stirring up suspicion with my current boss. But I listened. And the more I listened, the more I saw the shape of what was coming. The old world and the new world couldn't keep coexisting forever. Sooner or later, one would have to give way. In the meantime, I kept refining my role as the gentleman gangster. I made donations to churches, sent flowers to funerals, and picked up the check for whole tables of strangers at the restaurants I liked. People remembered things like that. And people who remember you fondly are less likely to testify against you later. I even started hosting dinners where I'd seat a judge next to a racketeer, a union boss next to a theater producer. By the end of the night, they were laughing together like old friends, and I was the man who'd made it happen. That's power you can't buy, but you can earn it, one handshake at a time. The trick was to make everyone think they were getting the better end of the deal. And in a way, they were. I wasn't looking to rob every man I met. Sometimes the real profit came in patience, in letting a connection grow until it paid off in ways money couldn't. By the end of that year, I wasn't just a name in the underworld. I was a name in the papers, a face on the street that people recognized. The cops hated that they couldn't pin anything on me. The reporters loved that I gave them a quote without giving them the truth. And all the while, the game was shifting. The smart men were watching. The dangerous men were waiting. And I was making sure I could speak to both in their own language. Because in this life, you don't just survive by being tough. You survive by being welcome everywhere and untouchable anywhere. In this life, whispers can be louder than gunshots. By the time winter rolled around, the city was a different place. The snow made the streets look cleaner than they really were, like a coat of paint over a cracked wall. But underneath, the same cracks, the same dirt, the same danger. In the clubs and cafes, people were smiling, laughing, dancing to jazz bands, but behind those smiles, deals were being made, grudges were being kept, and bullets were waiting for their turn. And that's when the whispers started. You'd hear them in the quiet corner of a card room, or over a glass of rye in a smoky back office. Names spoken just above a breath. Plans hinted at but never stated outright. Men leaning in closer, eyes darting toward the door before they spoke. The word was that Salvatore Maranzano was making moves, big ones. He'd been building a network not just in New York but all the way to Chicago and back. The kind of network that could rival Masuria himself. Now, in our world, you don't say a thing like that too loud. You don't want to be the guy caught spreading rumors about the boss. But you do want to know what's true and what's smoke, because sometimes smoke means fire. I had my ear to the ground, and what I heard made me think Maranzano wasn't just ambitious, he was strategic. He was playing the long game, making allies where Masuria had made enemies, offering deals that were too good to refuse. And every time he made a friend, Masuria lost one. The old man didn't see it at first. Or maybe he didn't want to. Masuria was used to ruling by fear, by loyalty to the old ways. He didn't think anyone could challenge him without paying the price. But I knew better. I'd seen enough to understand that the men who survive in this business aren't always the ones with the most soldiers, they're the ones who can convince other men to fight for them. I started meeting with people, carefully, quietly. A drink here, a handshake there. Never enough to draw suspicion, but enough to get a sense of where the winds were blowing. And the wind was shifting. Even Meyer noticed it. One night we were counting the weeks taken the back of a club when he said, "Lucky, you can feel it, can't you? This city's about to pick a side." I didn't answer right away. Just kept stacking bills. But I knew he was right. The tension wasn't just between Maranzano and Masuria. It was everywhere. Gangs that had worked together for years were suddenly keeping each other at arm's length. Guys who used to joke over cards were now checking who sat behind them. And then came the killings. At first, it was small-time guys. A runner here, a bookmaker there. Easy to pass off as street disputes. But then bigger names started showing up in alleys, or floating in the river. Men with connections to one side or the other. The newspapers called it gangland violence, like it was something you could put in a box and keep separate from the rest of the city. But the truth was, it was spilling everywhere. Masuria called a meeting, one of the few times I'd seen him rattled. We sat in the back of an Italian restaurant in Little Italy, the kind of place where the garlic smell clung to your clothes for hours. He slammed his fist on the table. "This Maranzano thinks he can take what's mine. He's a fool. We'll crush him." I didn't say it out loud, but I knew crushing him wouldn't be easy. Maranzano had men who believed in his vision. And that is harder to kill than any one man. Still, I played my part. Nodded when Masuria talked, agreed when he made plans. But in my head, I was keeping doors open on both sides. Because here's the thing, in a war like this, picking the wrong side means you don't get a second chance. One night, I got a call from someone close to Maranzano. Not an invitation exactly, more like a warning disguised as small talk. He said, "Things are changing, Charlie. The old way, it's dying. Don't get buried with it." I didn't answer right away. Just let the words sit there. Then I said, "Maybe I'm the one who decides what lives and what dies." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Just the sound of a man who already had his bet placed. That's when I realized the war wasn't coming. It was already here. It just hadn't reached full speed yet. The clubs still played music, the bars still poured drinks, and the papers still printed their gossip columns. But underneath it all, the city was bracing for something big. Men like me had to move carefully. Too quick, and you'd spook the wrong people. Too slow, and you'd be caught flat-footed when the first real shots were fired. I started making more appearances in neutral territory, places where men from both camps could be seen without starting rumors. At the same time, I sent trusted guys to quietly strengthen our own operations. If we were going to get dragged into this thing, I wanted to make sure we didn't bleed out fast. And through it all, I kept smiling. Shaking hands. Playing the role of the gentleman gangster. Because no matter how hot things got, I knew appearances mattered. In this life, you never let them see you sweat even if you can feel the heat rising all around you. The truth was, I wasn't loyal to Masuria. Not really. I was loyal to survival. And if survival meant stepping over the old man to get to the new world, well, that's business. But business in our world isn't just about numbers. It's about timing. And the timing wasn't quite right. Not yet. The city was a pressure cooker, and I could feel it building. I just had to make sure I was the one holding the lid when it blew. Sometimes the knife in your back is the one you placed there yourself. It's a funny thing about loyalty in our world, it's a currency just like cash. You can trade it, invest it, or spend it. But the moment you spend too much, you're broke. With Masuria, my loyalty account was running on fumes. I'd been with the old man long enough to know his strengths and his flaws. Strength, he could command fear like no one else. Flaw, he thought fear was enough. But fear is like ice in a drink, it melts if you sit on it too long. By the spring of 31, I'd already made my choice in my head, even if my hands hadn't done the work yet. The city was splitting down the middle, and I wasn't about to sink with a ship I knew was taking on water. But you don't just wake up one day and decide to betray the boss. Not in this business. You build it like a house, brick by brick, in the shadows. And every brick has to be placed without a sound. The first brick was information. I started feeding little pieces to Maranzano's people, not enough to burn me if it got traced back, but enough to make myself useful. Shipment schedules, small-time crew changes, who was falling out of favor with Masuria. Things that wouldn't cripple us but could give Maranzano an edge. In return, they fed me back just enough to keep me curious. Whispers about alliances in other cities. Men willing to switch sides for the right offer. Quiet promises that if I played my cards right, I'd have more than just a seat at the table when this was over, I'd own the table. The second brick was influence. See, in our world, soldiers follow orders, but captains? Captains follow opportunities. I started working the captains I knew were tired of Masuria's style. The ones who didn't like how he ignored the changing game. I didn't tell them to jump ship. Not yet. I just planted seeds. Things like, you ever think about how things could be if we ran things more like a business than a war? Or, there's a lot of money we're leaving on the table with these old rules. Men like that, they don't forget a conversation like that. It stays in their head, growing roots. The third brick was patience. You can't rush a betrayal. It has to feel natural, inevitable, like it was always going to happen. And for that, you need the right moment. That moment came over dinner. It was a small gathering, me, Masuria, a couple of his top men. We were at a private backroom in Coney Island, eating oysters and playing cards. Masuria was in a good mood, laughing about some two-bit hustler who'd tried to short him on a loan. But then, between deals, he leaned in and said, "Charlie, you hear the talk about me and Maranzano? Some people think I should make peace." I kept my face calm. "And what do you think?" He shook his head, smirking. I think peace is for men who are too weak to win a war. And there it was, the confirmation I needed. The old man wasn't going to bend. He was going to fight this thing to the last man, and he expected me to be one of those men. That night, after the game, I stepped outside into the cold ocean air, lit a cigarette, and made the final decision. Masuria wasn't going to survive this war. And I wasn't going to die in it. From then on, my moves got bolder. I started making more direct contact with Maranzano's inner circle, setting up quiet meetings in back rooms of bakeries, empty warehouses, even the back seat of parked cars. We spoke in half sentences, in code, always careful. But the meaning was clear: when the time came, I'd deliver Masuria. Not just help weaken him. Not just pull men away from him. Deliver him. That's the thing about betrayal, it's not complete until the man you betray can't walk away. Of course, there was risk. If Masuria even suspected I was thinking of switching sides, I'd be in the ground before sunrise. But I'd learned how to play both sides without showing my hand. It's like playing poker with two tables at once: you keep the chips moving, make sure nobody sees you cashing out from one to feed the other. Meanwhile, the killings were getting closer to home. Guys I'd grown up with were being taken out. Crews I'd done jobs with were vanishing overnight. The city wasn't boiling anymore, it was spilling over. One night, Meyer pulled me aside. "Lucky, this thing's going to end one of two ways: either Maranzano takes the crown, or Masuria keeps it and cuts off our heads. You sure you're on the right side?" I didn't answer him directly. Just said, "I'm on the side that wins." And that was the truth. In our world, the winner gets to write the rules. The loser gets remembered only in whispers. The final break came with a phone call. It was one of Maranzano's top lieutenants. His voice was calm, almost polite. "It's time, Charlie." We agreed on the place, a quiet lunch spot in Coney Island where Masuria liked to eat and play cards. I'd bring him there. I'd keep him busy. And then I'd step outside for a moment, give the signal, and let history take its course. It sounds cold, doesn't it? Setting up a man who'd been your boss, your protector, in some twisted way, your friend. But in this life, friendship is the first thing you sell when the price is high enough. And the price here wasn't just money. It was survival. It was the chance to be more than just another name in the ledger. It was the chance to reshape the game entirely. The seeds were planted. The ground was ready. And soon, very soon, the betrayal would bloom. Every betrayal needs a stage, and ours was set with cards, wine, and the smell of the sea. The morning of April 15, 1931, was quiet. Too quiet for what I had planned. The air was crisp, the kind of spring morning where the city feels like it's holding its breath. I dressed slow, deliberate, gray suit, white shirt, a tie that wouldn't draw attention. The less I stood out, the better. I knew this would be the last time I saw Joe Masuria alive. That thought didn't make me nervous, it made me focused. We'd arranged to meet at Nuova Villa tomorrow, a little restaurant in Coney Island. The kind of place where the owner knew when to keep the wine flowing and his mouth shut. Masuria loved it there, the food, the privacy, the view of the ocean through the dirty window glass. I picked him up in the late morning. He slid into the passenger seat, grinning like it was any other day. "Charlie, you bring your wallet?" "I'm feeling lucky." "Always, Joe," I said. My voice was steady, but my stomach felt like it was full of glass. The drive was smooth. He talked about business, debts being collected, a couple of small-time gangs making noise in Queens, nothing that would outlast a week. I nodded when I had to, smiled when it fit. All the while, my mind was somewhere else. When we walked into the restaurant, the owner gave a nod. He knew the drill. No strangers, no interruptions. We took our seats at a corner table. The smell of garlic and wine sauce hung heavy in the air. Masuria ordered for both of us oysters, clams, spaghetti with red sauce. He poured himself a glass of red, held it up like a toast. "To winning," he said. I clinked my glass to his. "To winning." The cards came out after the oysters. Gin rummy. Masuria loved it, said it kept the mind sharp. I dealt, he shuffled, and for a while, it almost felt like nothing was about to happen. Almost. At 2:45 p.m., I excused myself to make a phone call. There was no phone call. Outside, the air had shifted warmer, heavier. I walked down the short hallway to the back door, lit a cigarette, and leaned just far enough to see the corner. That's where they were: Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and Joe Adonis. 4 men who weren't just here for lunch. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. I gave a small nod, nothing dramatic, just enough. They moved like shadows, slipping into the restaurant without a sound. I didn't follow them in right away. I couldn't. There are some things you can't unsee, and I didn't need to watch the exact moment. But I heard it. 3 sharp pops. Then 2 more. Then silence. When I walked back in, Masuria was slumped in his chair, the cards still in his hand. Blood on the table. His cigar had gone out, a thin curl of smoke rising from the ash. The wine bottle was tipped over, the red pooling with the darker red on the tablecloth. Nobody said a word. The 4 men slipped back out the way they came, as quiet as they'd entered. I stood there for a moment, looking at him. This was the man who'd brought me up, given me my first real seat at the table, trusted me when I was just another street kid with ambition. And I'd been the one to bring him here. The cards in his hand were a losing set. It felt symbolic, like the game had been decided long before the bullets came. I didn't linger. I stepped outside into the bright afternoon, the sea air hitting me like a splash of cold water. My cigarette was still burning in the ashtray by the back door. I picked it up, took a drag, and started walking. By the time the police got there, I was long gone. The news spread fast. By nightfall, every man in the city who mattered knew that Joe Masuria was gone and that Salvatore Maranzano was now the undisputed boss of bosses. For me, it wasn't victory. Not yet. In our world, when you take out one king, you don't automatically get to wear the crown, you just make room for another. And Maranzano, well, he wasn't the kind of man you could trust either. But that was a problem for another day. That night, I sat in my apartment, lights low, the city humming outside the window. I poured myself a drink and thought about the look on Masuria's face when I'd last seen him alive. He wasn't scared. Not really. More surprised, like he'd just realized the cards had been marked from the start. Maybe that's how it always is in this life, you think you're playing the game, but the game's been playing you. I didn't feel guilt. Guilt doesn't keep you alive in our business. But I did feel something heavier than relief, a kind of weight that comes from knowing you crossed a line you can't ever step back from. When the drink was done, I set the glass down, leaned back, and closed my eyes. The city was still moving, still breathing. And so was I. For now, that was enough. You think when the king falls the game changes, but sometimes it just swaps the crown from one head to another. When Joe Masuria's body hit the floor, the city didn't stop. The trucks still rolled, the numbers still ran, and the speakeasies still poured their liquor. But underneath, everything shifted. The headlines called it a gangland slaying, but in the neighborhoods, people whispered a different word: promotion. Salvatore Maranzano wasted no time. By the next morning, word was out, he was now the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. He called a meeting. Not a suggestion, an order. Every important man in New York's underworld was expected to show. If you didn't, you might as well hang a target on your back. The meeting took place in a nondescript building in Midtown. No signs, no name, just a door that only opened if the right eyes were watching you. When I walked in, I saw them, the heads of the 5 families. Though they weren't officially called that yet, the lines were already drawn: Luciano, Mangano, Prophesy, Gagliano, and Bonanno. Men who controlled more money than the banks, more soldiers than the police, and more fear than the newspapers could print. Maranzano sat at the head of the table, his presence heavy, like a schoolteacher who didn't need to raise his voice to make you listen. He wore a perfectly pressed suit, gold tie pin, and an expression that told you he'd already judged you before you opened your mouth. He spoke in slow, measured Italian. "This life," he began, "is not chaos. It is not disorder. It is an empire. And like Rome, it will have structure. It will have rules." He laid them out one by one. First, no man was above the boss. Orders flowed down, never up. Second, disputes were settled inside the organization, never with outsiders. Third, loyalty was absolute. Betrayal was a sin that could only be washed away with blood. He divided the city into territories, each family with its own slice of the pie. He insisted every man pay tribute to him, a percentage of everything earned. It wasn't new, the structure had been there in pieces before. But Maranzano was formalizing it Roman style. He even compared himself to Julius Caesar. And that was the problem. See, Caesar didn't last forever either. Maranzano liked power, but he liked control even more. The kind of control that meant knowing who your friends talked to, who they owed money to, even what they whispered in their sleep. At first, I played along. I smiled when he spoke, agreed when he pointed, nodded when he asked if I understood. But I understood too well. A man like Maranzano didn't see allies, he saw tools. And tools eventually get put back on the shelf or broken. He didn't like the young guys having too much say. He didn't like the way I ran things, efficient, yes, but independent. He wanted men who bowed, not men who thought. It wasn't long before whispers reached me. Maranzano was looking at me the way a butcher looks at a cut of meat, deciding how best to carve it. Still, I kept my moves quiet. You don't challenge a man like that head-on, not unless you're ready to go to war. And I wasn't looking for another war. Not yet. Instead, I built relationships: Vito Genovese, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, men I could trust, at least enough to keep the ground under my feet steady. Meyer was the brains. He didn't wear a badge in this world, but everyone knew his worth. Numbers, strategy, negotiation, he could turn a bad hand into a winning one without touching a card. Frank was the diplomat. Smooth voice, smooth hands, never raised unless they were shaking yours. Politicians liked him, judges liked him, and that was gold in a business where one wrong court case could bury you. The three of us talked about the future. Quietly. In back rooms over the hum of a jukebox or the clink of glasses. Maranzano's rule couldn't last forever. His obsession with power made him sloppy, and when a boss gets sloppy, the streets take notice. He started bringing in bodyguards who weren't from our circles: Irish, Jewish, even some out-of-town muscle. Men loyal only to his paycheck. That kind of paranoia doesn't build trust. It builds resentment. Meanwhile, the money kept flowing. Gambling, bootlegging, construction rackets, the city was ours in practice, if not in title. But every dollar we made came with the reminder that Maranzano expected his cut first. Some men didn't mind. They liked the order. After the chaos of the Castellammarese War, the idea of one man keeping everyone in line was comforting. But I knew better. Order under a tyrant isn't peace, it's just a slower kind of war. One night, after a late meeting, I walked alone down Mulberry Street. The air was damp, the kind of thick summer night where the street lamps glow in a haze. I thought about Masuria, about the way we'd removed him to make way for Maranzano. Had we traded one chain for another? The thought stuck with me. Back at my apartment, I poured a drink and sat in the dark. I could hear the faint sound of a radio from the apartment across the alley, some slow Italian ballad drifting through the night. I thought about Caesar again. About how Brutus wasn't his enemy until Caesar made him one. And I knew then, if Maranzano kept pushing, he'd make his own Brutus. Maybe it would be me. When the city sleeps, the real moves are made in the dark. By the summer of 1931, the streets of New York were buzzing like a hive, but not with bees, with men who had everything to gain or lose in the shadows. Maranzano ruled like a king, but even kings leave cracks. And I had learned long ago that it's in the cracks where power slips through your fingers. The first step was subtle. Meetings with trusted men, always careful, always in neutral territory. Backrooms of bakeries, warehouses on the docks, quiet tables in cafes where the staff would look the other way if the right words were said. I worked closely with Meyer and Costello. We plotted not with weapons in hand but with information: who could be persuaded, who could be bought, who would fall if nudged just enough. In our world, strategy often matters more than strength. The whispers of discontent were easy to find. Maranzano's paranoia was growing. His bodyguards, loyal only to him, patrolled every corner. He started changing routines, avoiding old friends, and scrutinizing everyone who walked into a room. That's the kind of weakness you exploit, fear disguised as vigilance. I reached out to Vito Genovese quietly, making it seem like casual conversations. But underneath, we discussed timing, the placement of men, and the vulnerabilities of our new boss. Every detail mattered. One misstep and it would all collapse. Meanwhile, we made sure Maranzano didn't suspect. I continued my duties in full view, smiling in the right places, nodding when he spoke, agreeing in meetings, even praising his organizational reforms. The trick was visibility without risk, a performance convincing enough to reassure him that I was loyal, even while I was orchestrating the next move. Letters were passed quietly, instructions whispered. Allies from the old world who still remembered Masuria's fall were invaluable. They taught patience and the art of moving men like chess pieces. No piece moved too soon, or the whole game was lost. One evening, Meyer and I sat in the back of a small speakeasy, cigars lit, glasses of bourbon sweating on the table. The place was quiet except for the soft jazz playing from a corner phonograph. "Timing's everything," Meyer said, tapping ash into the tray. "Strike too early and Maranzano's men crush us. Wait too long and his paranoia gets worse. We need the perfect moment, precise, controlled, inevitable." I nodded. That's exactly what I'd been thinking. The plan had 3 layers. First, isolation. Maranzano could never be taken in a crowd without risk. He needed to be somewhere controlled, a location where every exit could be monitored, every angle anticipated. Second, distraction. We ensured his focus was elsewhere. Meetings, inspections, even minor disputes, all orchestrated to make him feel busy, important, untouchable. A man who feels untouchable is often the easiest to remove. Third, execution. Carefully placed men, trained for silence and efficiency. Not a hint of hesitation. Not a single sound to betray the plan. Precision. We mapped it all out, drawing diagrams, memorizing routines. Every potential variable accounted for. And yet, there was still a human element: unpredictability. A guard might notice. A servant might hesitate. A city policeman might wander too close. That's why we ran through every scenario, rehearsed every step in hushed tones until the plan was as flawless as we could make it. Outside, the city went about its business. Children played in alleys, women hung laundry, streetcars clanged along the rails. Nobody suspected the storm forming in the shadows. Even Maranzano's closest lieutenants remained unaware. They trusted the arrangements and routines, thinking their boss's vigilance made him untouchable. That confidence, that sense of security, was the key. I made sure to appear ordinary. Walking the streets. Visiting clubs. speaking politely to men who had no idea I was planning the greatest move of my life. A casual nod here, a laugh there, everything normal on the surface, everything calculated underneath. And then came the final week of preparation. Men were briefed, exits checked, timing confirmed down to the minute. Every member of the team knew their role, but none knew the entirety of the plan. Compartmentalization was essential, no one could betray the whole strategy, even under pressure. I remember sitting alone in my apartment late at night, the city lights shimmering through the window. I poured myself a drink, lit a cigarette, and thought about the years leading to this moment. From the Lower East Side streets, running small cons and learning every corner of the city, to building influence among captains, politicians, and bankers, every step had led to this, orchestrating a coup without firing a single shot myself. And yet, despite the meticulous planning, I couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. The men who would carry out the act, loyal soldiers who trusted me, and the man at the center, Maranzano. Unsuspecting. Confident. Human. It's strange, the clarity that comes when you're on the edge of history. The city sleeps, and the streets are silent. You can hear your own heartbeat above the hum of distant traffic, and you realize that one action, one decision, can reshape everything. The night before the move, I reviewed everything once more. Routes, times, signals, contingency plans. I imagined each step, each face, each sound. Precision was the difference between survival and disaster. Finally, I set the plan in motion. Men moved into position, signals were agreed upon, and the city remained oblivious. The shadows had become my allies. The darkness a cloak. And the morning would soon belong to those who could act while others still dreamed. The plot in the shadows wasn't just a plan. It was a turning point, the moment where strategy, timing, and courage intersected to change the course of the New York underworld forever. Even the tallest king can fall when the shadows move just right. The morning of September 10, 1931, began like any other in Manhattan. The streets were already alive with vendors, streetcars, and the usual hum of a city that never truly slept. But in the quiet corners, the plan we had honed for months was about to unfold. Maranzano, confident and meticulous, believed he was untouchable. Every exit in his office had been double-checked, every guard vetted, every routine memorized. That confidence would be his undoing. I arrived early, as usual, under the guise of routine business. I carried myself like a loyal soldier, calm and deferential. Nothing betrayed the storm gathering just beyond the walls. Inside, Maranzano moved through the morning as if it were ordinary. He read the morning newspapers, sipped his coffee, and greeted his bodyguards with familiarity. The men were loyal to him by salary and fear, not by trust. That distinction would matter. The first signals went out quietly. Meyer Lansky's men, positioned strategically in nearby buildings, communicated in subtle gestures. The people on the street kept their eyes down, just another part of the city's background noise. As I stepped into Maranzano's office, I offered the usual pleasantries. "Good morning, Sal," I said, smiling. "Charlie," he replied, nodding. "Sit. We have much to discuss today." He didn't notice the tension behind my eyes, the anticipation of months of planning, the careful orchestration of every detail. To him, I was the same loyal lieutenant he had trusted. We spoke briefly about business, territory, and the latest intelligence on other crews. His tone was confident, commanding, yet there was a slight tightness in his jaw, a subtle tension in his shoulders. That was my cue. The men moved in quiet, efficient shadows in the room. The bodyguards, caught off guard, were neutralized in seconds, no shouting, no struggle, just sudden and precise action. Maranzano turned, startled. His eyes scanned the room, realizing too late that the trap had closed around him. The shots were quick. Sharp, controlled, and final. A man who had ruled by fear for so long fell in silence, the empire he had built suddenly in question. I stepped back, letting the team handle the aftermath. It wasn't my role to pull the trigger, my role was to orchestrate, to ensure the precision of the strike and the safety of everyone involved. Once it was over, the office was silent except for the faint hum of the city outside. Papers lay scattered, coffee cooled, and the morning sun fell across the scene like a spotlight on history. Maranzano was gone. And with him, the last remnants of the old Roman-style rule in New York's underworld. The news spread quickly. By midday, the whispers on the streets had become certainty: the king was dead. A new era was beginning. But victory in our world isn't just measured in the elimination of one man. It's measured in control, in stability, and in the loyalty of those who remain. That's why, even after Maranzano fell, we moved cautiously. I convened with Meyer, Costello, and a few trusted men in a small, secure apartment. The city's ours to stabilize, I said. But we move carefully. The people who followed Maranzano may be loyal to him, not us. And that's dangerous. Meyer nodded, understanding every nuance. We consolidate. Keep the businesses running, reassure the families, and don't give anyone a reason to resist. We moved quickly. Territories were reorganized, old crews reassigned, and the flow of money remained uninterrupted. Any disruption could have sparked chaos, but our planning allowed us to maintain the illusion of continuity. Even Maranzano's former lieutenants were co-opted. Some were persuaded with promises of safety, others with financial incentives, and a few simply understood that resisting would be fatal. In those weeks, I realized the true lesson of power: it's not just about taking out a king, it's about building a throne that others are willing to serve. I walked the streets of Manhattan during those days, observing the reactions. Businesses continued, neighborhoods remained calm, and the city carried on as if nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, men were calculating, watching and learning from the fall of a powerful figure. And I learned too. Power is delicate, fleeting, and dependent on perception. Even the sharpest knife cannot cut unless the hand that wields it knows when and where to strike. By the time October rolled around, our hold on the city was secure. The families had accepted the new order, and the streets understood. Lucky Luciano had emerged not only as a strategist but as a force capable of shaping the underworld without resorting to chaos. It was a quiet victory in many ways. No fanfare, no celebration, just the steady rhythm of life continuing with one less king to disrupt the flow. Sitting in my office one night, I poured a drink and reflected. Maranzano had been intelligent, ruthless, and ambitious, but he lacked the flexibility to adapt. I had learned to bend, to observe, to manipulate without overt force. That difference, subtle as it was, had changed the course of history. The city didn't notice the change immediately. The newspapers covered the event with sensational headlines, but the people who mattered, the families, the captains, the soldiers, understood the shift in power quietly, methodically. And that was the way it had to be. Power, once seized, must be maintained with subtlety. Loud announcements and displays are for amateurs. Real control is invisible until it's absolute. By the end of the year, the streets whispered a new name with respect and caution: Lucky Luciano. Not the old king, not the rigid boss, but the man who had orchestrated the rise of a new order while keeping the city intact. Even now, the memory of that day lingers. The planning, the shadows, the precision, it was a culmination of years learning, observing, and waiting for the right moment. History remembers the violent, but history also remembers the careful, the patient, the strategic. And in that delicate balance, power finds its quiet voice. The fall of Maranzano marked the end of one era. But it was only the beginning of another, one that I would shape with intelligence, patience, and the kind of subtle authority that only comes from understanding every angle, every player, and every shadow in the game. True power doesn't shout. It whispers, quietly shaping everything without anyone noticing until it's too late. After the fall of Maranzano, New York's underworld was no longer ruled by fear alone. The streets had learned a harsh truth: strength alone doesn't secure control, strategy does. And that was my lesson, the one I carried forward like a secret weapon hidden in plain sight. The first months of 1932 were about stabilization. Families were restructured, alliances reaffirmed, and boundaries clearly marked. The old wars had left scars, and a single misstep could ignite another. My role was not to dominate with violence but to guide with subtle authority. Every meeting, every handshake, every nod was calculated. Not everyone knew the full scope of my vision, but that was intentional. Control thrives in quiet, in patience, in decisions made just beyond the eye of suspicion. Meyer Lansky became the mind behind financial operations, orchestrating investments, bootlegging operations, and gambling rings with precision. Frank Costello handled politics, smoothing over relationships with politicians, law enforcement, and business owners. Vito Genovese was our muscle in enforcement, ensuring loyalty was maintained without unnecessary attention. I became the silent conductor, weaving these elements together. Each piece of the city's criminal machinery functioned seamlessly, like a clock, efficient, precise, and invisible to those outside the inner circle. The beauty of this power was its quietness. No grand parades, no public threats. The city carried on oblivious while the underworld functioned under a new code: respect, order, and efficiency above all. I often walked alone late at night through the Lower East Side, the West Side, and up into Harlem. The streets were alive with ordinary life: children playing, vendors shouting, taxis clanging. Nobody guessed the depth of the strategy that kept this city in balance, the subtle influence guiding every move, every crew, every dollar. Control doesn't need recognition. Power whispers, and when it whispers correctly, everyone obeys without even realizing it. That was my philosophy. By mid-1932, whispers about me spread quietly through the ranks. Men who had served Maranzano began to realize that my guidance was steady, fair, and effective. I didn't rule with terror, I ruled with inevitability. And inevitability is a stronger motivator than fear. I was no longer just a survivor of the Castellammarese War, I was a strategist, a diplomat, and a force that moved the city's underworld like pieces on a chessboard. Every decision had layers, every action was deliberate, and every silence carried meaning. The press continued to focus on sensational stories: murders, arrests avoided, but the truth was subtler. The real changes happened behind closed doors, in whispers, in quiet agreements that shaped the future without drawing attention. I invested in businesses that looked legitimate on the surface but funneled money through controlled operations. I brokered peace between crews that had no reason to trust each other. I ensured loyalty through subtle persuasion, not overt intimidation. And with each success, the city's criminal infrastructure became more resilient, more organized, more profitable. Still, there were risks. Every new order attracts envy, suspicion, and ambition. Men grow restless, alliances shift, and old grudges resurface. That's why I kept distance, maintaining the illusion of detachment while always observing, always calculating. There were nights I reflected on the lives we had taken, the betrayals executed, and the risks assumed. It's a heavy weight, but one that comes with command. Power is never free of consequence, it's earned through sacrifice, calculation, and the courage to act when others hesitate. I remember sitting in my office one evening, the skyline lit with the faint glow of lamplight and neon signs. The city was humming with life, indifferent to the silent orchestration that ensured its continuity. I poured a drink, lit a cigar, and thought about how far we had come: Masuria's fall, Maranzano's demise, the consolidation of the 5 families, all milestones that marked a new era. But it wasn't chaos that defined this era. It was strategy, patience, and the quiet assertion of control. The world outside never saw the meticulous planning, the careful orchestration, or the subtle influence that shaped outcomes. They saw results. And results are what matter. I often told Meyer and Frank, the loudest man rarely rules. It's the quiet voice that guides the storm. And it was true. Men listened, followed, and feared what they couldn't fully see or understand. By 1933, the foundation was set. The structure of the Mafia in New York had changed permanently. Orders flowed clearly, territories were respected, and profit maximized. Violence became a tool, not a necessity, used only when subtle influence failed. I had earned respect not just through action but through the demonstration of intelligence, foresight, and control. Loyalty was no longer coerced, it was cultivated. The contrast between fear and respect became apparent. Men who had once followed blindly out of terror now obeyed because it was rational to do so. That shift was subtle, almost invisible, but it was profound. It changed the culture of the underworld, setting a new standard for leadership. Even decades later, the lessons from that time endure. Power is strongest when it moves quietly, invisibly, and inevitably. The city may never know the names of those who shape it in the shadows, but the effects are undeniable. I often reflect on the journey, from a street kid in the Lower East Side to soldier, strategist, orchestrator, and silent voice of power. Every betrayal, every calculated risk, every quiet decision had been a step along a path that led here. And through it all, the city moved on, unaware. Life continued in its noisy, chaotic rhythm while the true rulers operated in the calm, unseen currents beneath the surface. That is the essence of lasting influence, not spectacle, not terror, not dominance alone, but the quiet, deliberate guidance that shapes events before anyone realizes they've been shaped. Even as history writes of violence, wars, and power struggles, the quiet voice remains. It whispers decisions, aligns interests, and ensures continuity. It is the mark of true control. And so, as the city hums under the cover of night, as the streets pulse with life, and the world turns unknowingly, the quiet voice of power endures. It doesn't boast. It doesn't demand. It simply moves unseen, inevitable, and unchallenged. Lucky Luciano's reign was not about terror or spectacle. It was about structure, foresight, and subtle authority, the kind of power that can last for decades because it is neither flashy nor easily challenged. The streets may forget the men who fell. They may forget the headlines, the killings, the wars. But the quiet voice, the unseen hand that orchestrates from the shadows, that endures. And that is how power whispers. History doesn't remember the quiet whispers, but it feels their impact long after the voices fade. The years that followed weren't filled with constant gunfire or bloody battles. They were quieter, subtler, yet no less significant. The underworld of New York had shifted into a new rhythm, one dictated not by brute force but by strategy, foresight, and invisible influence. I watched as the streets I once ran as a boy evolved. Families, crews, and territories adapted to the new order, understanding that the days of impulsive violence were over, at least for those who wanted to survive. Every man who moved in the shadows now understood that intelligence could be more powerful than firepower, and foresight more lasting than brute strength. Meyer Lansky expanded operations into new ventures. His understanding of finance and networks made the illicit world more profitable but, more importantly, more sustainable. We began investing in enterprises that seemed legitimate on the surface: casinos, nightclubs, and construction, yet every dollar flowed back into the machinery of the mafia. These were not just operations, they were the scaffolding of influence, invisible to those outside our circle. Frank Costello handled politics with an unmatched subtlety. He built bridges with lawmakers, police, and businessmen. Corruption was not chaos, it was order, arranged meticulously. His quiet diplomacy ensured that power was respected without overt confrontation, a lesson that would echo for decades. Vito Genovese maintained enforcement, but enforcement itself became a tool of precision. Violence was no longer reactionary or flamboyant. Every action was measured, every threat calculated. The streets began to understand that the true danger wasn't the gun in your hand, but the man who could influence entire networks without ever showing his face. I often reflected on my role in all of this. My victories weren't the ones splashed across newspapers. They were the silent ones, orchestrating the right alliances, timing actions to perfection, and ensuring that the city itself ran as a predictable, profitable ecosystem. The quiet voice of power didn't seek applause, it sought results. Even those who had once opposed us adapted. Men who survived the chaos of Maranzano's fall and the consolidation of families either aligned with the new order or faded into obscurity. History doesn't pause for resistance, it adjusts around the unyielding currents of influence. I walked through neighborhoods that had once been battlegrounds, now calm under the invisible oversight we maintained. The vendors, children, and passers-by remained unaware of the complex networks dictating the flow of money, loyalty, and power in their city. That invisibility was our greatest asset. One evening, sitting in my apartment overlooking the East River, I pondered the idea of legacy. Power, if not carefully wielded, decays. Influence without foresight can collapse under its own weight. That's why the greatest achievements aren't measured in headlines or violence, but in structures that persist beyond individual lifetimes. I began mentoring younger men not just in the art of action, but in the art of planning. Observing, listening, calculating, and influencing without overt displays, these were the skills that would ensure the survival of our operations for generations. Power, I realized, is like water. It finds its way through cracks. It nourishes, and it erodes only when mismanaged. The city, meanwhile, evolved alongside us. Prohibition had ended, but the habits, networks, and structures we had established did not vanish. They transformed. Casinos in Havana, investments in Manhattan, subtle infiltration into legitimate businesses, all these moves ensured that our influence could extend beyond streets and neighborhoods, reaching into the broader economic and political spheres. And yet, for all the sophistication, there remained danger. Rivals, ambitious men, law enforcement all posed risks. That's why subtlety, discretion, and timing remained paramount. The mistakes of the past, impulsive killings, miscalculations, overreaching authority, were reminders that even the quietest power is fragile without vigilance. I often thought about the men who had fallen, like Masuria and Maranzano. They had shaped their eras with aggression and control, but they lacked the patient, calculated approach necessary for enduring influence. They left openings that could be exploited, openings I had learned to recognize and navigate. History, in many ways, rewards the patient strategist more than the aggressive conqueror. And so, the legacy we were building was not merely a record of events, but a framework for enduring authority, one that prioritized adaptability, foresight, and subtle control over spectacle and force. By the mid-1930s, our operations were no longer just about New York. National and international connections flourished. The foundation for coordinated activity among the five families became solid. This wasn't chaos anymore, it was governance, underwritten by secrecy, loyalty, and influence. I also recognized the importance of perception. The public, the police, and even other criminals needed to believe that the world was unpredictable, when in reality it moved according to plans conceived in quiet rooms among trusted men. The illusion of chaos is often the best protection for order. Yet, for all the planning and influence, I never forgot the human element. Men are unpredictable. Loyalty is fragile. Pride and ambition can disrupt even the most precise schemes. That's why observation was critical, learning not just what men said, but what they did, how they reacted, and what they feared. Every decision, every alliance, every subtle negotiation contributed to a legacy that would outlive us. It was a quiet legacy, one not marked by monuments or plaques, but by the invisible architecture of influence and authority. I realized that true power is not in the moment of action, it's in the enduring control, the structures, the loyalty networks, and the foresight that allow influence to persist. Violence may enforce rules temporarily, but lasting power is built in silence, observation, and patient orchestration. As the city slept, I often walked the streets alone, reflecting on the life I had carved out. From the narrow alleys of my youth to the apex of influence in the underworld, every choice, every risk, every calculated move had contributed to a system that would endure. And so, the quiet voice of power persisted. Not as legend or myth, but as reality, shaping outcomes, guiding decisions, and maintaining order from the shadows. By 1940, it was clear the structures we had built, the networks we had organized, and the subtle influence we wielded would endure far longer than any single individual. The true measure of success wasn't how many enemies we eliminated, or how loudly we asserted control, but how effectively we could maintain authority without drawing unnecessary attention. I often said to my closest advisors, history remembers the visible acts, but it is shaped by the invisible hand. That invisible hand, the careful orchestration, the quiet control, was the legacy we left. And that is the final lesson: true power whispers. It doesn't need validation, spectacle, or applause. It moves quietly, decisively, and invisibly, shaping the world so subtly that those outside the circle never realize how deeply it has been influenced until it is already too late. The quiet voice of power endures.